From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
This is Lecture 8A for pages 965 to 970. Although the United States and the Soviet Union had fought side by side during World War II, an intense rivalry developed following the war. This rivalry became known as the Cold War. In February of 1945, Allied leaders met in Yalta, located in Crimea, which is part of Ukraine until being annexed by Russia in 2014. Yalta is on the Black Sea. At the Yalta Conference, President Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, as well as Winston Churchill, divided up end-of-war responsibilities to rebuild Europe. The big questions included, how are we going to end the war with Germany, and what are we going to do once the war ends? Leaders agreed that nations should be allowed self-determination, or the right to decide their own types of government. The Soviets were in charge of overseeing Eastern Europe, while Western Europe would be proctored by Great Britain, France, and the US. This is one reason there was such a clear-cut division between Eastern Europe and Western Europe by the end of World War II. Eastern European nations naturally aligned themselves with the Soviets, whereas Western European nations aligned themselves with the United States. Once the war ended, it became clear that the US and USSR had opposing goals. The goals of the United States included 1. Trying to encourage the spread of democracy while preventing the spread of communism. Secondly, the U.S. was looking for raw materials and marketplaces to fuel our growing industries, so yes, we were imperialistic. Thirdly, we wanted to help rebuild European governments that would be pro-USA friendly again, so that they would more likely buy things from us. And finally, we were interested in stabilizing Germany and eventually reuniting East and West Germany. And this was a goal that didn't happen until the end of the Cold War. Now, the Soviets had their own goals following World War II. First, they were encouraging a worldwide workers' revolution to promote communism. They also needed to rebuild themselves, which they're going to do using resources from their Eastern European satellite nations. They were also interested in controlling or influencing nations in Eastern Europe to counter the U.S. influence in Western Europe. And finally, the Soviets did not want to see East and West Germany reunited because they believed that Germany was capable of waging war again if allowed to be one big nation once more. See, the Russians have had a history of being attacked by their Western neighbors. They were attacked by the Poles, or the Polish people, in the 1600s. They were attacked by the Swedes in the 1700s. And they were attacked by Napoleon, we've already learned this year, during the early 1800s. And then, of course, they were attacked by the Germans during World War I and World War II. This history of attacks perhaps explain why they wanted to separate themselves from the western portion of Europe by buffering themselves or surrounding themselves with Eastern European nations. Under the Yalta Agreement, Stalin had said that he would allow for free elections to take place across Europe. Instead, these nations, which included Albania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland, and Yugoslavia, they all became communist. All of these nations, with the exception of Yugoslavia, became known as satellite buffer states, and free elections clearly had not been held. After the death of President Roosevelt in April of 1945, Harry Truman became the U.S. president. Truman was dismayed by the fact that free elections had not occurred. In order to hash out these issues, Truman, Stalin, and Churchill met in Potsdam, Germany, at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945. Stalin evidently later stated that communism and capitalism could not exist in the same world. It was clear by the end of World War II that the U.S. and Soviets could no longer remain allies. The Soviets began actively spreading their beliefs and way of life across the world, and the U.S. did the same. Soon there was a clear division between democratic and communist nations in Europe. The term Iron Curtain was used to describe this division within Europe, as both the Soviets and Americans attempted to influence the nations on the European continent. This term was coined by Winston Churchill during his famous Iron Curtain speech on March 5, 1946, as he addressed a crowd at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, An iron curtain has descended across the continent.
The U.S. attempted to stop the spread of communism using a policy called containment. Containment was a policy that attempted to block Soviet influence and aggression by preventing it from spreading to the rest of the world from Eastern Europe. Containment was part of a broader U.S. policy by President Truman that became known as the Truman Doctrine. As a result of the Truman Doctrine, in which the U.S. Congress gave over $400 million worth of aid to Greece and Turkey in order to stop the spread of Soviet influence, the U.S. began the policy of containment. Truman Doctrine aid to countries that agreed to reject communism also included the Marshall Plan, in which we pledged to support needy Western European nations. By giving them generous financial support, we hoped to stop the spread of the Soviet Union's influence in these vulnerable places. We've already learned that Germany was divided into two separate nations following World War II. France, Great Britain, and the U.S. occupied West Germany and helped to establish a democratic regime. The Soviets occupied East Germany. We've also learned that the city of Berlin was divided up in the same way amongst all four Allied nations, but was located in the heart of East Germany. In 1948, the occupation of West Germany ended, and West Germany was allowed to rule itself. The Soviets were threatened by this move and held the city of Berlin hostage. They cut off all roads to Berlin. Stalin had bet that the West Germans would give up Berlin. In response, and aided by the Americans and British, supplies were flown into West Berlin every 2 minutes or so for nearly 11 months. Stalin finally backed down and reopened the roads. The Berlin blockade, and then the Berlin airlift, were among the first Cold War conflicts. Soon the Soviets and Americans developed an intense rivalry that, as we know, was called the Cold War. And it was called this because there was never any direct war between our two nations. Instead, we found other ways to fight or compete with one another. First, we formed rival alliances. In 1949, the U.S. and Canada formed a defensive alliance called NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which also included 10 European nations. The Soviets formed their own alliance called the Warsaw Pact in 1955 and was supported by other communist nations in Eastern Europe. Some countries refused to take sides and were non-aligned nations, or they followed a policy of non-alignment. These included India, Yugoslavia, as well as China. We also found other ways to compete with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We had an arms race, meaning we attempted to build up our atomic and nuclear weapons arsenal or supply. Soon, both nations were stockpiling atomic bombs. In 1950, we began working on a thermonuclear weapon. We tested our first H-bomb in 1952. The Soviets tested their first in 1953. By the 1950s, it was clear that both nations were willing to completely annihilate one another using these types of weapons. Our willingness to go to the brink or edge of nuclear war on so many occasions became known as brinkmanship. Finally, we soon began competing with the Soviets in a space race. The Soviets developed the first intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBMs, and they were the first to invent these. We followed suit. These are missiles that have the ability to travel great distances to deliver a nuclear bomb to an intended target. These missiles were also used in space exploration. The Soviets launched the first satellite into space in 1957, called Sputnik. The U.S. followed with its own in 1958 and then began spying on the Soviet Union using U-2 spy planes, which are special planes that can be flown at extremely high altitudes. One of our planes was shot down by the Soviets in 1960, which led to more tension between our two nations. The Soviets dominated the space race early on, launching the first probe to the moon in 1959 and put the first human in space in 1961. And this was the first human to actually fully orbit the Earth. His name was Yuri Gagarin. The first American in space followed in 1961. That was Alan Shepard. And in 1962, John Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth completely. The Soviets put the first female astronaut in space in 1963. In 1969, the U.S. had the first manned moon landing. So this intense rivalry will continue until almost 1991 when the Soviet Union broke apart. Thanks for listening. Bye.